Hello, my friends, and welcome back to my channel. I'm your host, Collie Mortwood, and you've walked into this week's episode of Tuesday Tales of Terror. Yes, that's right. Tuesday Tales of Terror. And we are reading The Man Who Was Poe by Avi. And I have a special treat for us tonight. I have the Haunted Mansion ambience going on in the background. You might not be able to hear it, but you can see it and you can feel spooky. We are closing in on Halloween, ladies and gentlemen. We have just over a week and it'll soon be the big day. So I'm going to be completely honest with you. I totally forgot that today was even Tuesday until about 15 minutes ago. So we're just kind of jumping in, we're winging it. But better late than never. And like I said, I'm going to finish this book if it's the last thing I do. And that being said, I have excellent news. We are starting part 3. There are only 30 pages left. So, that being said, I think we're finishing this book tonight. And I'm not going to dilly-dally any longer. I'm going to jump right in so we can get it going and get it done. So, just a quick recap of where we are now. Mr. Edgar Allan Poe / Dupin has figured out the mystery of what happened to Mother and to Aunt Prue. And he believes that one of them was murdered and the other ran away. He's not sure which one is which because they are twins, but he believes that one of them is still alive. He also believes that Sis is being held captive by Mr. Ratchet. Now, he's given up. He's kind of stepped out of the whole thing and he's writing his story because that's his main focus. Edmund has taken it upon himself to go to the church and he found his mother. Hi. And they were reunited and she shared her side of the story, which helped fill in some of those gaps. And that was the end of part 2. So we are now starting part 3, chapter 19, The Story. It was night. There was a man, there was a boy, and they moved through the city with grim determination, uncertain of their fate, uncertain of the fate of those they sought. Poe, sitting at the table, writing in his notebook by the light of a small candle, could see them distinctly. 2 empty bottles lay at his feet. A third bottle, almost empty, was near at hand. And he could hear the characters too. "I found her," one of them said. Poe wrote that down, then frowned. It didn't feel right. The voice came again. It was more insistent than before. "Mr. Poe, I found her." Poe looked up. It was very dim in the room, and at first he wasn't sure what he was seeing. Gradually he began to see that it was the boy from his story, standing before him. He was dripping wet. Behind him stood someone who appeared, Poe was not sure at first, to be a woman. She was dressed in dirty clothes and was in an advanced state of exhaustion. It was as if she had traveled some immense distance. Poe stared at the 2 of them, then looked down into his notebook and read what he had been writing, only to look up again with a start. A thrill of excitement passed through him. The characters he'd been writing about had actually come to life. They were standing there before him. Never in all his years had he had such a vivid sense of the reality of his own creations. "At the church," the boy said. "I'm not surprised," Poe murmured, delighted that these characters of his were speaking their own lines. It was so much easier than having to struggle to find the words himself. The boy turned, and under Poe's fascinated gaze, helped the woman to the bed, where she lay down. She sighed and closed her eyes. The boy took a place near her on the edge of the bed. Poe smiled. It was his dream come true. He needed only to look at these images, watch what they did, and describe them on the page. For a while he studied the two. Then he bent over his notebook and wrote. The boy turned and helped the woman to the bed where she lay down. She sighed and closed her eyes. The boy took a place near her on the edge of the bed. Did you buy food? Poe, without looking up from his writing, shook his head. Only a necessary drink, he said, softly, and to no one in particular. He wasn't sure who had spoken. Please give me money. I need to get her some food. I am trying to write, Poe said. Please, she needs it very badly. Poe looked about, surprised to find that the boy character had drawn very close. Then, to his horror, he saw the boy reach for the bottle. Before the boy could grasp it, Poe himself snatched it from the table and hugged it to his body. Warily, Poe studied the boy's face. Now he was no longer certain it was his character, but then who was it? Just the thought made his head ache. Do you know who I am? The boy asked. Yes. Who? Poe thought carefully before answering. Puzzling questions, he reminded himself, are not beyond all conjecture. He studied the boy's face carefully. Even as he did, a name came into his mind, but he rejected that name as not right. He tried another. Is it, he said, Edmund? Yes. Poe grunted with satisfaction. The other boy is better, he said. He does what he's told to do. What other boy? Poe put a hand to his head. The one here. His name is Mr. Dupin. Poe slammed his fist on the table. Poe! He cried. Please! Poe closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw that boy, Edmund, standing there, waiting. Grudgingly, he reached into a pocket and dragged forth some coins and held them out. When Edmund took them, Poe turned to look at the bed. The woman was still there, but the other character was gone. Annoyed, he bent over his writing again and tried to recapture the vision. Edmund glanced at his mother, trying to make up his mind if he dared leave her. She was asleep. He studied Poe. Edmund was not at all certain the man really knew who he was. At the moment, he seemed to be utterly absorbed in his work. I'm going to get some food, Edmund announced. Poe said nothing. I'll be right back. Edmund left the room, shut the door behind him, then paused to listen. When he heard the steel pen scratching across the paper, he took one step only to stop, put his key in the lock, and turn it. Mr. Poe would not be able to get out. Suddenly, Edmund was caught up in a memory of the last time that he locked the door. For a second, he had the distinct sensation that he was seeing himself in some story. What would happen, he wondered, if he opened the door again? Would Sis be there this time? With a shake of his head, he cleared his thoughts of the foolishness and moved toward the stairs. When he walked into the saloon, Mr. Throck was laying cards out on the table for a game of solitaire. At first, he gave the boy no more than a quick glance, but when he realized that it was Edmund, he stared at the newcomer. The man behind the counter looked down. Yes, boy. What do you want? Please, sir, Edmund said, dumping Mr. Poe's coins on the counter. A meat pie and candles. Large pie or small? This is all the money I have, sir. The man made a slow count of the coins. 4 candles and a large pie, he said, taking up the money. While the counterman got his purchase ready, Edmund stole a glance at Throck. What are you looking at? The big man growled. Are you Mr. Throck? Edmund said. Throck considered a moment and then said, That's me. Were you engaged by my aunt to find my mother? I was. Well, I found her. Did you now? But I haven't found my sister. Throck frowned. Well, that's nothing to do with me. I need your help, Edmund said. Throck rubbed the side of his face with a large hand. What about that friend of yours? He gone off? Mr. Dupin? If that's his name. He won't help me any more. What's that? He's crazy. Is he? Did he find your mother for you? In a way. Well, does he get the reward then? Mr. Throck, I don't know anything about a reward. That's as may be. He rubbed the side of his face for a moment. Then he said, If I help you find your sister, will you put in a word for me so that I get it? Mr. Throck, I'll do what you tell me to do. Your word now. A good word for Mr. Throck. I promise. Throck sat back, gave a grunt of satisfaction, finally pulled a chair near to him. Well then, what exactly do you want me to do? It's my sister. I want you to make Mr. Dupont find her. Thought you said he was crazy. But I think he knows where she is. You want it out of him then, do you? Yes, sir. You sit down here and you tell me all about it. Hmm. When Edmund unlocked the door to the room and stepped inside, Poe was still writing. The boy glanced quickly toward his mother. She lay asleep on the bed. He came further into the room, then beckoned to Throck, just behind, to follow. When Poe didn't seem to notice their arrival, Edmund approached him. Mr. Poe, he said softly. Poe continued to write. Mr. Poe, Edmund repeated, raising his voice slightly. This time Poe lifted his head. Edmund could see from his eyes that he was having a hard time focusing. Sometimes, Poe said, you lose control of your characters. They want to take over, do what they want. It's a question of who is stronger, writer or character. But it's all right. I'm almost finished with you. What? And your sister. Mr. Poe, it's me, Edmund. I've brought Mr. Throck. Poe stared first at the boy, then at the large man who loomed behind him, his bulk magnified in the smallness of the room. Throck grinned. Evening to you, Mr. Poe, he said. Ah, yes, Poe said. They threw me out of the army, too. I'd been drinking. He turned to Edmund. Why did you bring him here? He's no longer part of the story. Mr. Poe, Throck said, this boy here, he says you can tell us where his sister is. But his sister is here, Poe snapped, slapping his notebook. He bent to his work. The pen moved over the paper. Throck looked at Edmund for an explanation. He thinks she's in the story he's writing, Edmund said. Mr. Poe, he went on more urgently, you can find her. I know you can. Edmund, Poe cried, flinging down his pen. This is what's important. Moving suddenly, Edmund snatched the notebook from under Poe's hand. As though struck, Poe leapt from his chair and tried to grab the book back. Throck was quicker. He stepped in front of Poe and heaved him against the wall. Poe looked from Edmund to Throck with frightened eyes. Edmund held the notebook tightly. Find Sis, or I'll destroy it, he said fiercely. On the bed, Mrs. Ratchet stirred, sat up, and looked about in confusion. Edmund noticed her. It's all right, Mother, he called. This is Mr. Throck. He's going to help us find Sis. Throck turned. Pleased to meet you, madam, he said. And sorry of your misfortunes. Your sister had come to me for help, and we was endeavoring to get you for her. And if this man is willing, we'll get your daughter, too. Unexpectedly, Poe jumped and grabbed up his carpet bag. My manuscript, he demanded, his hand outstretched. Edmund shook his head. Not until you help us find Sis, he said. Be reasonable, sir, Throck suggested. You want to get on with your work? He wants his sister. I want to get them that got into the bank, for I understand from the lad here that they're connected. Now, you put your mind to it. It can all be done in one effort. Poe glared at the man.
Didn't I tell you, Throck added, that Throck sees it through?
For a moment, Poe's gaze wavered. Then, giving way abruptly, he sank back into the chair.
Much better,
Throck said.
I must have the notebook, Poe said.
Help us first, Edmund insisted. Poe let out a deep breath, closed his eyes, and leaned forward, resting his head in his upturned hands. Then he sat back. He reached for a bottle, but saw that it was empty, and put it aside. He looked inquiringly at Throck. Throck grinned and held up a full bottle, saying,
Help us first.
Poe cleared his throat.
Mrs. Ratchet, he said, his voice ragged, have you any idea where they might have put your daughter?
Mrs. Ratchet shook her head. I only knew they had put her in the mausoleum, she replied. When I went there, she was gone.
And you, Mr. Throck, Poe said. I suppose the boys told you everything. Do you have any ideas?
Throck shook his head.
He mentioned some sort of message.
A message? Poe echoed. Edmund said, The one I found in Mrs. Whitman's house. Poe looked about, then searched his pockets, and retrieved the coded message that Edmund had found. He held it out to Throck. Throck took it, and in exchange gave Poe the bottle. While Poe quickly opened the bottle and drank from it, Throck examined the paper.
I can't read it,
he said, handing it back. Poe glanced mockingly at Edmund before reading the message out loud. Meet me at the hotel. I've moved girl and gold. Must leave. Sunrise at 6 a.m. Throck grimaced.
The first part may make sense, he said, but sunrise should come closer to 7 o'clock these days.
Poe took out his watch.
It's past 2 now.
5 hours, said Throck as if he had observed something profound. Poe nodded. Then, to Edmund's dismay, Poe offered Throck the bottle. The night watchman grinned and helped himself to a swallow. Edmund's mother, on the bed, dropped off to sleep again. Feeling betrayed, Edmund retreated into a corner and watched as Poe and Throck passed the bottle back and forth. The two men discussed all that had happened. It was as if there was some private matter which had nothing to do with Edmund. Even as he tried to concentrate on their talk, which grew increasingly slurred, Edmund found himself dozing. He didn't want to. He fought it. And yet, all the same, he slept. Chapter 20. Sunrise. At nearly 4 in the morning, Edmund woke with a start and looked about. His mother was asleep on the bed. Throck, also asleep, was seated on the floor, his head thrown back against a wall, mouth open and snoring. Poe slept, too. He was slumped over the table amid several empty bottles, head cradled in his arms, fingers clutching his notebook. The last candle, no more than a stub, was burning low. Suddenly conscious that much of the night had passed, Edmund ran to the window. Though it was still raining, he decided it must be close to dawn. Alarmed, he turned back to the room. His mother, he realized, would not be able to help, nor, he saw, would Poe or Throck. With growing panic, he looked about for something that might help him and noticed the coded message on the table. He snatched it up. But when he confronted the symbols again, his heart sank. Once more, he felt engulfed by feelings of fear and insufficiency. He rushed over to Poe and shook him. "Mr. Poe! Mr. Poe!" he cried. Poe continued to sleep. Edmund, trembling with frustration, gave it up. Taking hold of himself, he placed the message on the table near the candle and racked his brain to remember what Mr. Poe had said the symbols meant. Gradually, it came back to him. Meet me at the hotel. I have moved girl and gold. Must leave. Sunrise at 6 a.m. Edmund glanced out the window again, wondering how long it would be before sunrise. For a moment, he watched the rain trickle down the window panes. Where had they put her? Once more, he gazed around at the sleepers, but this time a thought came to him. Something Mr. Throck had said about the hour of sunrise given in the message, that it wasn't right. Even as Edmund remembered that, something Mr. Poe had said popped into his head. Lies have their own truth. Edmund considered the message another time and tried to pry some new meaning out of sunrise. Not a lie exactly, but some other sense, some other truth. Had Ratchet meant not dawn, but something else? Where had he seen this word sunrise before? Somewhere, the day before, when Peterson had tried to catch him. And suddenly, Edmund remembered. He hurried over to the table. "Mr. Poe," he whispered. Poe looked up with only partially open eyes. "What is it?" he managed to say. "At the docks yesterday," Edmund said, growing more excited, "where Peterson tried to catch me, there was a boat, a sloop. She was called Sunrise."
Sunrise? Poe repeated. Is it sunrise already?
"Mr. Poe," Edmund said, almost begging, "I think sunrise may be a boat."
Edmund, let me be.
"We have to find my sister."
Who?
"Sis,"
Edmund said, shaking him. Sis is dead, Poe murmured, clutching his notebook and slumping over it again. The way it must be.
Edmund let go of him in disgust. Then he went to Throck and shook him hard. "Mr. Throck," he tried. "Wake up!" He shook him harder. This time Edmund caught sight of a pistol butt sticking out from his jacket. Startled, he stepped back. For a moment, he just stared at the gun. Then he looked about the room at the two men asleep before him. Edmund shook his head. Cautiously, he pulled the pistol out of Throck's jacket. It came with surprising ease. He went back to Poe. "I'm going to the docks," he said urgently. "To the sunrise."
Too late, Poe mumbled. Sis dead.
Anger flamed within Edmund. Taking hold of Poe's notebook, he pulled out the pages of new writing, tore them to bits, then flung them on the floor. Poe, oblivious, continued to sleep. Pistol in hand, Edmund stepped into the hall and shut the door behind him. As the door closed, he heard movement in the room, as if someone had gotten up. He hurried down the steps. The street was deserted. The light was a lifeless gray. The rain had turned to a swirling web of damp, wet cold, and from somewhere far the thunder rumbled. For a moment, Edmund could only stare out onto the bleak scene. Then, after wrapping the pistol into his shirt, he rushed out into the street. It was about 5 o'clock when Edmund reached the wharf where he had seen the sloop Sunrise. The place seemed deserted, the quiet broken only by the occasional splash of waves and the soft moan of wind. He himself was drenched and cold, but now he was on the wharf. Edmund realized that if the boat was still there, he had no idea what to do about it. Then he thought he saw something move. He waited and peered forward. The misty rain made it difficult to see. A light went on. The best Edmund could determine was that at about the middle of the wharf, the very spot where he had seen the two boats the previous afternoon, someone was moving about. Edmund pulled the pistol from under his shirt and tried to check to see if it was loaded. He thought so, but he wasn't sure. Did he need to cock the hammer? Adjust the trigger? He could only hope it hadn't gotten wet. He decided it didn't matter. He was determined to use it somehow, if need be. Closer still, he grew sure that what he saw was a light bobbing up and down on the larger of the two boats. That would be Sunrise. His heart beat faster. The mist began to lift. Now he could see that the boat's forward sail was flapping idly in the wind. And he was able to make out that the figure he'd noticed was crouching on the wharf, uncleating a rope. Uh-oh. Edmund understood then. The ship was being readied to leave. He took a few more steps. The person heard, stood up abruptly, and gazed in Edmund's direction. Edmund froze. For a few moments the man continued to stare. Then he resumed his work. Edmund crept on. Now he could see that the man was dressed in rough clothing and a heavy sea jacket, and that his hair was blonde white. Mr. Peterson! His hand on the pistol. Edmund stopped no more than 20 feet from him. Peterson looked up. "Is that you, Ratchet?" he demanded. Edmund lifted the pistol and pointed it directly at the man, hoping he would see it. "Mr. Peterson!" he called. "Who is that?" "I want my sister," Edmund said. Peterson stood still. Edmund managed a few more steps, trying with difficulty to hold the pistol steady. The brightening sky now allowed him to see Peterson quite clearly, and the man saw him. "Ah, you," he said. "Where is she?" Edmund demanded. Peterson offered a most pleasant smile. "Who's that now?" "My sister." "Your sister," the man echoed. "I don't care about the gold," Edmund said as evenly as he could. "I wouldn't try to stop you. I just want you to let Sis go." Peterson took a tentative step toward Edmund, who lifted the pistol higher. Peterson stopped and smiled. "Is my sister on the boat?" "We'll just wait until Mr. Ratchet gets here," the man suggested, and turned back to the rope that he had been untying. "I want her!" Edmund called to him. "It's no crime for a father to have his daughter with him, is it?" Peterson said over his shoulder. "He's not her father!" Edmund cried. "And she doesn't want to be there! You stole her!" "Believe me, I don't want her. That's Ratchet's notion. He thought having her would make our sliding off that much more certain. If it was me, I'd have got rid of her long ago, like I did the other." He looked about. "Mr. Ratchet may be good with plans, but he's squeamish about the hard parts. His claim is that you can't play cards without chips. Perhaps he was right. Seems the girl is a chip. So, if you put that pistol down," Peterson said with a smile, "it might be possible for you to see her for yourself." "Is she there then?" Edmund stammered, trying to brace himself against the gusts of wind which kept pushing and pulling his gun-holding arm. "I just said, if you put that thing down, we can talk. That's Ratchet's point, isn't it? 'I'm a businessman,' he said to me, 'and businessmen bargain, and if one thing doesn't work, try another.' That's his way, and he's in charge." Peterson flung the rope onto the boat, where it landed with a thud. A wave lifted the bow and eased it away from the wharf. The wharf timbers creaked. Edmund glanced at the Sunrise. She was single-masted, decked over. Sis, he decided, must be below. "Well now," Peterson said very casually, "you're welcome to see for yourself." He moved to one of the two remaining ropes that held the boat to the wharf. "Go on," he coaxed. He uncleated it and flung that too on the boat. Only one rope remained. Edmund, increasingly uncertain and upset, took a step closer. Peterson backed away and lifted his hands. "I won't touch you," he said. Trying to keep an eye on Peterson, Edmund inched up to the edge of the wharf and examined the boat. It seemed deserted. "Sis!" he called. There was no answer, only the slapping of waves on the hull. Edmund glanced quickly over his shoulder at Peterson. The man was merely standing there, looking at him. "Sis!" Edmund tried again, leaning forward, mindful of his balance. It was then that he was struck from behind. All right, y'all. I know that we are at the end of our time, but we only have 10 pages left. So I'm just going to push us through and finish. So this is going to be a longer episode tonight. And we're starting with chapter 21, The Chase. "Edmund! Edmund opened his eyes. Poe was looming over him. Just behind him was Throck. "Where are they?" Poe demanded. "Where did they go?" Still groggy, Edmund struggled to a sitting position. His head hurt badly. "On the boat," he managed to say. "I'm sure they've got Sis." "Is that them?" Poe asked, pointing toward the river. Edmund twisted around. Out beyond Fox Point, through the swirl of mist and squally rain, he could make out the sunrise tacking hard against the western marshes. "I think so," he said, trying unsuccessfully to get to his feet. "Can we get them?" he asked. "If we're lucky," Throck returned. He stomped down the dock toward the other boat, a sloop-rigged launch named Peggy. She was a much smaller boat than the Sunrise, with considerably less sail. Poe began to undo the mooring ropes. For a moment, Edmund merely watched, too dizzy, too bewildered to understand what was happening. Then he realized that the men were about to give chase to the Sunrise without him. That was enough to propel him to his feet, then hurry to Poe and help him lift the last of the ropes. Throck, meanwhile, had already hoisted the sloop's mainsail, tied it down, and stationed himself at the tiller. "Come on!" he cried. Poe freed the last rope, then clambered aboard the boat. For a brief moment, Edmund remained on the wharf, too flustered to move, but as he stood there, the Peggy's sail caught the wind. She began to slide away. "Wait!" he cried, and with a leap he jumped, falling into a heap at the bottom of the boat. Then he staggered up to his feet and looked over the side. The Sunrise was now moving across the river, out toward the bay. The Peggy followed, spanking the wind-chopped surface of the water with an incessant beat, pitching and yawing, sometimes violently. Edmund struggled toward the helm. "Can we get them?" he called to Throck a second time. "We'll try," Throck boomed out, never taking his eyes from the Sunrise. "Wet sails don't help." "They have my sister," Edmund said. "I'm sure they do." "Glad to hear it," answered Throck. "And the gold." "Better yet." "How did you know where I was?" "He figured it out," said Throck with a nod toward Poe. "In a dream, he said." Edmund turned. Poe had taken a place before the mainsail. With his wet hair plastered back over his forehead, his great coat flowing out behind him, his intense gaze riveted on the Sunrise ahead, he stood like a ship's figurehead. Holding to the thwarts, Edmund went forward to Poe. "Mr. Poe!" he called above the wind and rain. "Thank you for coming." For a moment Poe remained mute. Then he said, "Did you think I would let you make an end to my story?" "Sir?" "Why did you destroy my manuscript?" "You wouldn't help me." "Do you really expect to see your sister alive?" "She is alive." "That man Peterson, he's on the boat. He all but said she was." "Edmund, she has died." "That's your story," Edmund cried. "This is real." "Edmund," Poe returned with just as much vehemence, "you may have destroyed the manuscript, but you will not do the same to my story." Sickened, Edmund turned away, fixing his eyes instead on the Sunrise. He could see her tacking back and forth in and out of the mist and rain, edging toward the bay in a southerly direction. Throck, following move for move, held the Peggy to their outside, which kept Edmund busy ducking under the shifting boom. Edmund could see for himself that while the Sunrise was a bigger boat with more sail, the Peggy had greater maneuverability. "Edmund," Throck called, "did you take my pistol?" Only then did Edmund remember. "They must have taken it from me." "Then we shall hear of it soon enough," Throck returned. Edmund watched the Sunrise. Now he could see Ratchet at her wheel, turned to look at the Peggy as, moment by moment, she gained on them. Edmund looked over his shoulder toward Poe. The man was simply staring ahead. Edmund was suddenly certain he had some plan in mind. Edmund made his way back to Throck. "Mr. Throck!" he called. "What's that?" "You won't do anything Mr. Poe tells you to do, will you?" "Do you see me here?" "I do, but—"
And we two made a bargain, didn't we? I know, but then don't you worry about me.
Edmund gazed at Poe, then at the sunrise. The Peggy was still following tack for tack. Lightning and thunder filled the sky. The rain began to intensify.
As long as we're in the Narrows, Throck cried, trying to make himself heard over the weather, we can work with them. But when they get to wider water, into the bay as they're trying to do, they can outrun us, sure.
Can you tell us where they're going?
The bay, then the ocean.
Can you cut them off? Edmund returned.
It's what I'm trying, Throck called. You might try praying for this muck to lift. If it comes any thicker or stronger, I'm likely to lose sight of them. Get yourself up by the jib and be prepared to run her to one side or the other. The faster you can do it, the quicker we'll move.
Edmund started to go.
And boy, keep an eye for rocks. They come at you when you're least aware, especially in shallows. I'll need my eyes for the thieves.
Edmund scrambled to the forward sail, where he saw that Poe was still staring fixedly at the sunrise. The intensity of his look made Edmund's skin prickle. Throck held to his course. There were times when Edmund lost sight of the sunrise completely, but after moments of breathless suspense, he would see their boat again. And once or twice, when they drew close to the shore, he made out boulders, their jagged crowns breaking the surface of the water into froth and foam. Each time he cried, "Rocks!"
I see them,
Throck returned. Sudden gusts of wind brought the rain down in curtain-like sheets, momentarily obscuring their view. As they tried to batter through the rushing waves, their pace became lumbering. Lightning and thunder cracked the sky. 5 miles below Providence, the bay widened greatly. The sunrise, reaching the point first, began to come about.
There! Shouted Throck. Here's our chance. Watch which way they go.
Edmund peered over the bow through the storm. He could see for himself that if the sunrise turned successfully, she would have a long run toward the south. The Peggy would never be able to match her speed. Suddenly, the Peggy made a move to starboard. The sunrise ahead turned the same direction. "She's going that way!" Edmund called, pointing west. In response, Throck roared,
"Coming about! Throw the jib!"
The sail instantly refilled with wind. The boat heeled. Spray and rain blew into Edmund's face and prevented him from seeing. Wiping his wet hair out of his eyes, he searched for the sunrise. He could no longer see her before them. He looked back. Shocked, he saw her there. As the sunrise cut to the west, Throck, instead of following as Edmund expected him to do, cut to the southeast, running as close into the wind as possible. The two boats were going in opposite directions. Edmund spun about. "They'll get away!" he cried, not understanding what was happening.
"Patience, boy!" Throck called. "Patience!"
Edmund stole a look at Poe. The man's face was a tense mask, unreadable. Edmund turned his eyes towards the sunrise again. The boats continued to sail in opposite directions. Anxiously, he waited for Throck to give orders to pull the jib and resume the chase, but Throck held a steady course. As Edmund strained to see, he could just barely make out the sunrise coming about sharply and begin to make her move down the bay, bucking wind and waves. It was as if she was following them. "Mr. Throck!" Edmund cried out in bafflement. "They're chasing us!" Throck grinned but held steady. Edmund gripped the ropes tightly, expecting Throck to come about, but to his dismay, Throck continued to hold the Peggy on the same southeasterly course, glancing often over his shoulder to judge the two boats' relative positions. Kneeling on the bow, Edmund could feel his muscles begin to cramp from tension. Then he heard Throck cry, "Ready, boy!" Edmund squeezed the jib lines as tight as he could.
"Coming about!"
Throck shouted. Edmund yanked. The jib whipped across the bow. Behind him, the boom swung to the port side with a crack. The Peggy came hard about, heeling so deeply that water trickled in over the thwarts. For a moment, Edmund thought that they were going to capsize. But a second later, the boat pulled herself upright. Now the Peggy had the wind behind her and was flying up the bay with hardly a ripple or sound beneath her bow. To Edmund's astonishment, she was heading straight for the sunrise.
"We've got them!"
Throck yelled. Remembering Poe, Edmund looked around. The man remained wedged firmly against the mast, eyes fixed upon the other boat. Edmund grew more uneasy. But now Ratchet and Peterson realized what had happened. As the two boats drew rapidly toward each other, it was the sunrise that came about with a hard heel, which raked her mast dangerously toward the surface of water as she headed back up the bay toward Providence.
"Trapped them!"
Throck exulted. Even Edmund saw it. "Hurrah!" he cheered. The next moment, however, he heard a bang. At first he thought it was lightning. But then he realized it was Peterson shooting at the Peggy. But with both boats moving north, the wind strong from the south, the rain unceasing, and the distance still great, bullets were of no use. Peterson soon gave up. Once again, Ratchet shifted his course, heading the sunrise toward the western shore.
"He's heading for shallower water," Throck cried, "trying to pull us onto rocks. Watch for them."
But hardly had the sunrise made that shift than she suddenly came about yet again. Once more the two boats were running head to head. As Edmund watched, torn between searching for rocks and gazing at the sunrise, he saw Peterson disappear from view. In moments he reappeared. In his arms he was holding someone. Edmund leaped up. "He's got Sis!" he screamed. She was struggling, but Peterson held her fast.
"Edmund, keep watching for rocks!"
Throck shouted. But Edmund only had eyes for Sis and the sunrise. The two boats were rushing headlong toward one another, closing rapidly now. The Peggy was sailing smoothly while the sunrise seemed to be dancing up and down as if on a prancing horse. Above them lightning cracked and thunder clattered. Rain raked the deck, but so steadily did both boats maintain their courses that Edmund was certain they would collide. He darted a look back at Poe, only to realize that the man was now standing just behind him. Edmund turned again toward the sunrise. Peterson, trying to steady himself, had made his way to the bow and was holding the struggling girl in front of him, like a shield, even as he held a pistol out in the other hand. Ratchet, still at the helm, was yelling at him. "Mr. Poe, look out!" Edmund warned, then dropped to the deck. Poe remained upright as if daring Peterson to aim at him. Sure enough, Peterson fired. The bullet went astray. The boats were no more than 40 feet apart. "The girl!" they heard Peterson shout. Edmund pulled himself up to a kneeling position again and looked. Sis had broken away from Peterson and was scrambling toward the stern of the sunrise. Peterson was in full pursuit. But then, as she approached the helm, Ratchet suddenly abandoned the wheel and lunged at her. With the rudder no longer under control, the sunrise swung wildly about. There was a loud snap and the shriek of tearing wood. Trying to regain control, Ratchet flung himself back to the wheel, turning it wildly now this way, now that. As Edmund watched, breathless, Peterson drew close enough to Sis to make a grab for her just as she leaped into the water. Edmund jumped to his feet. The instant he did, Poe's arms clamped down on him. "Let me go!" Edmund screamed. "The story!" Poe cried into his ear. "The story!" Absolutely frantic, Edmund butted and kicked Poe back, and once free, flung himself into the bay. Icy water closed over him, its coldness numbing. He could not move arms nor legs. He began to sink, swallowing a mouthful of water. He gagged. The convulsive movement brought back consciousness. He kicked out and swung his arms, pushing himself with swift downward thrusts until his head burst above the water's surface. Once there, he thrashed about in search of Sis. The first thing he saw was the sunrise on her side. She had capsized, and Sis was nowhere to be seen. "Edmund!" came a cry. "Edmund!" Edmund turned. Sis was no more than 5 feet away, working hard to keep afloat. They began to swim toward one another. Throck, meanwhile, had brought the Peggy sharply about in the wind. As if a brake had been applied, the boat stood still, trembling. Now Throck eased her forward and drew up to them. Hanging over the Peggy's side, he hauled Sis and Edmund onto the boat. Throck really came in handy, huh? The boy looked over his shoulder just in time to see the sunrise slide beneath the waves.
"They're gone!"
He heard Throck cry with horror. As Edmund and Sis huddled together, the Peggy sailed beneath the rain toward the dock from which they had started. Edmund, suddenly remembering, looked for Poe. Poe was staring out over the bay, but then he turned and looked at Edmund. Only then did Edmund realize the man was weeping, and Edmund knew it was not for Peterson and not for Ratchet. Chapter 22, The Beginning of the Story. 6 hours later, Edmund and Poe left Sis and her mother and walked down the steps from the tiny room together. Poe had already announced that he was leaving. Now the two of them stood awkwardly on the street. "Will you and Mrs. Whitman marry now?" Edmund asked. A pained expression came into Poe's face. "I don't know," he said gravely. "I will fetch the daguerreotype and bring it to her." He shook his head. "But I believe I have too many enemies." "Why?" "My art is too strong. I frighten the timid," Beau said, and abruptly began to walk away. Edmund watched him go. Unable to restrain himself, he called out, "Mr. Poe!" Poe stopped. "You never did want to save my sister, did you?" Edmund said. "You only wanted to make sure she'd die." Poe said nothing. Edmund felt a swell of disgust. "You're always talking about death," Edmund continued, "but it's living you're frightened of." Poe turned. His eyes were full of anger. Suddenly he thrust a hand into his pocket and drew out a piece of paper. Edmund recognized it as a part of a page from the notebook. "Edmund, you said I wished your sister to die. I say I wished my story to live. I ask you, in what fashion will your sister live longer? In her life? Or in this, my story that would have been? Here is what remains of the story you destroyed." He let the paper flutter to the ground. "Goodbye," he said, turned, and walked away. Edmund watched him go. When he was sure Poe had truly gone, he went to where the paper lay. After a moment, he picked it up and read what the man had written. Prologue. At the far back of the top floor of an Ann Street tenement was a room. It was a small, single-windowed room, not much warmer than the outside, for there was only a solitary candle to heat it. The room contained a table, a chair, and against one wall, a trunk. Opposite the trunk was a narrow bed, upon which sat a boy. His name was Edgar. The name Edgar was crossed out. In its place, a new name had been inked in. Edmund. And that is it! The end of the book! We made it, and we did it together. And I am so happy that we did. And I'm very proud of us for pushing through. It wasn't exactly a horror. It was more of a mystery. I mean, it was a little bit of horrific. There was Aunt Prue being found dead in the very beginning of the book. But besides that, yeah, it was very mysterious. So next week is the Tuesday directly before Halloween. I think I'm going to find us a really creepy, spooky short story to kind of get us in the mood. And I am so grateful that you stuck it out. I know that tonight was a bit longer of an episode, almost a double episode, to be honest, but I could not let tonight end without finishing this book because, like I said, it was a promise that I made to myself and I did it. My therapist would be so proud. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel, like this video if you liked it, and I'll see you. See you soon. See you next week, as a matter of fact. Ciao for now.